He humiliated her in court, called her a nobody in front of everyone. Then she reached into her blazer, pulled out a federal badge, and arrested him on the spot. "You're a nobody in a uniform. Sit down." Those were the exact words that came out of Judge Warren Belridge's mouth. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, and didn't care that the entire courtroom had just gone silent. Officer Tiana Mosley stood still, hands lightly folded in front of her, mouth slightly open in disbelief. The kind of disbelief that wasn't loud, just heavy, like the oxygen in the room had changed. You could see a woman on the jury blink hard and shift in her seat. A young man in the back, possibly a student, looked down at his shoes. Tiana didn't say anything back. Not yet. She just held that gaze with the judge. A calm stare that didn't rise to his level of disrespect, but didn't back down either. Belridge, sitting with his thick-rimmed glasses, his usual tired smirk, and an ego bigger than the bench he sat on, leaned back in his chair. He sipped from his glass of water, like he hadn't just insulted a black female officer in front of a packed courtroom. It was happening in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Courtroom 6B, a case about racial profiling. A teenager named Raylan Cross had been pulled over, yanked from his car, and roughed up by two officers, one of whom had a previous complaint. It had gone viral because of a cell phone video. Tiana wasn't on the case directly. She'd been asked to testify because of her work in the department and her previous statements about the same officers involved. She'd barely gotten 3 sentences out before Belridge interrupted her. The prosecutor, a younger attorney named Jenna Kessler, stood up fast. "Your Honor, with respect, Officer Mosley has every right to testify." Belridge cut her off. "Not when she comes in here grandstanding with second-hand complaints and zero legal merit. I don't care what uniform she's wearing. She's not credible." Gasps weren't allowed in court. But it happened. People didn't yell, but you could feel the sharp shift of energy. A black officer being publicly humiliated by a white judge, right in the middle of testimony about a racially charged case. Tiana didn't flinch. She didn't blink either. She stood there with the quiet kind of power you can't teach in a police academy. Then, in a voice that didn't shake, she asked, "Are you saying my word is worthless because of what I wear? Or because of who I am?" The judge scoffed. "You may leave the stand." But Tiana didn't leave. Not right away. The room had no noise, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. She slowly stepped down, still silent, still holding his gaze. But something about the way she walked. It didn't look like defeat. It didn't even look like protest. It looked like control. Belridge shifted in his seat again. His fingers tapped the desk. He was irritated, but also nervous. It was fast, barely noticeable, but Tiana saw it. So did Jenna, and so did the court officer at the side of the room. Tiana walked past the front row, nodded slightly to someone sitting behind the prosecutor's table, and made her way to the gallery. The judge tried to move on with the case. "Next witness?" But before the next person could even stand, Tiana turned around. She reached into her blazer, pulled out a small leather case, and opened it, revealing her federal ID. The seal on it was unmistakable. "My name is Officer Tiana Mosley," she said, this time projecting louder. "I'm a senior investigator with the U.S. Department of Justice, Internal Affairs Division." Someone in the jury gasped. Belridge's face dropped. Tiana walked calmly toward the bench, but didn't approach too close. "Effective as of this morning, you're under federal investigation, and by authority granted to me, I'm placing you under arrest." The entire courtroom froze. You can't do this," Belridge stammered, voice suddenly losing its arrogance. Tiana continued. "You're being charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify court records, and accepting unlawful bribes. You have the right to remain silent." Every single person in that courtroom watched history flip inside out. The woman who had just been called a nobody in uniform had now arrested the most powerful man in the room. But before that moment could even begin to settle, people began whispering, "Who is she, really?" Tiana Mosley wasn't someone you'd find posting selfies in a uniform or chasing headlines. She stayed under the radar on purpose. If you passed her in the grocery store in Fort Wayne, or saw her walking her pit mix, Ruby, on West Jefferson Boulevard, you'd probably just think she was a quiet, polite woman with good posture and sharp eyes. Not the type you'd picture bringing down a federal judge. But the people who knew her, really knew her, understood that Tiana didn't do noise. She did results. Born in Evansville, Indiana, Tiana grew up the middle child of 3 girls. Her mother, Denise Mosley, worked the night shift at a nursing home, and her father, Clarence, drove trucks across state lines. They didn't have a lot, but they had rules. "Do what's right, even if nobody's watching," her mom used to say. That stuck. She didn't always want to be a cop. At one point, she thought she'd be a history teacher, but after watching her older sister get roughed up by 2 local officers at a party when she was 17, something shifted in her. She saw the way the system moved to protect the wrong people and bury the rest. The idea of just accepting it didn't sit right with her. So she joined the police academy. 10 years later, she was the kind of officer whose name came up in whispered conversations when young recruits asked who was worth watching. She never went loud, but her arrest records were solid. No use of force complaints. She was known for sitting with victims longer than she had to. Known for filing reports that other officers tried to forget. Known for standing up when others shrugged and walked away. But it wasn't until her 5th year on the force that she realized she couldn't just work inside the system. She had to work above it. It started with a case in South Bend. A black teen named Byron had been sentenced to 8 years for a petty theft that should have been probation. Tiana had testified about inconsistencies in the officer's report, but the judge ignored it. That judge? Warren Belridge, before he transferred jurisdictions. Tiana had left that courtroom that day with a tight jaw and a quiet promise. She began collecting notes, not just on Belridge, but on judges, officers, lawyers who bent the law behind titles and robes. One name led to another. She found patterns, altered police reports, missing evidence, and sentences that didn't match the crime, always affecting the same type of defendant, always signed off by the same judge. She took night classes in criminal justice reform, reached out to federal agents working quietly on judicial corruption in the Midwest. And then came the phone call that would change everything. Agent Corey Delgado. He was with the DOJ, and he'd been watching Belridge for years, quietly. No arrests, no leaks. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could testify, gather records, get close. Tiana didn't hesitate. She was tired of watching people suffer while men like Belridge sat behind their benches like kings. By the time she got assigned to testify in the Raylan Cross case, she already had a mountain of documentation. Phone logs, emails, closed-door recordings. And, most importantly, a federal green light to make an arrest if Belridge violated procedure again. And when he called her a nobody, that was it. She'd walked into that courtroom with 2 identities, one as a regular officer giving testimony, and another hidden in the pocket of her blazer as a federal investigator holding the keys to a reckoning. But what made Tiana so rare wasn't just that she was willing to take down someone powerful. It was how long she'd waited to do it the right way. No shortcuts, no leaks, just careful steps. Patience is what keeps justice clean, her father once told her. Rushing just makes a mess. She'd waited nearly 4 years for this moment. But now that the robe was off the table, it was time to talk about what Judge Belridge had really been hiding, and who else might have helped him cover it up. Raylan Cross wasn't a troublemaker. He was 18, freshly graduated from Bishop Luers High School in Fort Wayne, working part-time at a hardware store while saving up for community college. On a Sunday night in June, he left his girlfriend's house just before midnight, music low, seatbelt on, signal used at every turn. 3 blocks from his house, flashing lights lit up behind him. 2 officers, Jackson Veers and Brian Lattimore, pulled him over, claimed he'd rolled through a stop sign. What happened next was caught by a neighbor's doorbell camera and a friend on FaceTime. They yanked Raylan out of the car. No questions. No explanation. Slammed him against the trunk, searched the car without cause, and kept him on the curb for almost 40 minutes. Raylan didn't resist. He kept asking, "What did I do?" but got no answers. The story would have died right there. Another forgotten traffic stop, if not for the video. It went viral within 48 hours. Hashtags, protests, interviews. Local news called it deeply troubling. National outlets picked it up the next week. It wasn't the first time officers Veers and Lattimore had been accused of excessive force, but it was the first time the evidence had been this clear. The department launched an internal review. Raylan's family filed a civil suit, and the DA, under mounting pressure, opened a criminal investigation. That's when Tiana's name came up. She wasn't part of the unit involved, but she knew both officers. Veers had been flagged in 2 past misconduct cases. Both times, the reports disappeared. She had filed an anonymous internal memo questioning his promotion the year before. It was ignored, so when they asked her to testify, she didn't hesitate. But she knew walking into Judge Belridge's courtroom meant more than just giving a statement. It meant stepping into the lion's mouth. Because Belridge had history, the kind that didn't make headlines, but made defense attorneys clench their teeth. He had a habit of dismissing witnesses who challenged police narratives, had once thrown out video evidence, calling it inconclusive. Defense lawyers stopped requesting bench trials in his court altogether, and the same officer names kept popping up on his dockets, always getting the benefit of the doubt. Tiana had tracked it all, quietly, patiently. She'd built a chart that connected complaints to rulings, tracing decisions back over 6 years. It was like a spider web, and Belridge sat right in the middle. But what made Raylan's case so dangerous for the judge was its visibility. Cameras, public scrutiny. He couldn't brush it under the rug like the others. Still, he tried. He refused to allow the doorbell footage as primary evidence, claiming it lacked legal framing. He called Raylan overly emotional in a preliminary hearing. And when Officer Mosley was called to give context on the 2 involved officers, he saw an opportunity to discredit her and control the narrative. Only he didn't know who she really was, or what she carried in that blazer. He saw a black woman in uniform and assumed she was just another piece on the board. The thing is, Raylan's story wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was the crack that exposed the rot beneath the court's surface. He was the name that forced Tiana's hand. She'd gone through everything the right way, shared evidence through DOJ channels, filed reports that took months to process, waited for clearance, waited for signs. But Belridge didn't wait. His outburst in court was the final piece. It wasn't just disrespect. It was judicial misconduct, live in front of a jury. And once he broke that line, she had what she needed. When she turned and presented her badge, she wasn't acting out of anger. She was fulfilling a federal order that had been waiting in silence. Raylan's case wasn't the beginning. It was the breach. The proof that this wasn't just theory or suspicion. It was real, it was happening, and it had been allowed to fester too long. But what the public didn't know, yet, was that Judge Belridge hadn't acted alone, and Tiana's files had names, more than just his. Long before Judge Belridge called Tiana Mosley a nobody, she had been quietly documenting everything he did. She wasn't alone. Agent Corey Delgado had spent nearly 6 years tracking a string of federal complaints that led to Indiana courtrooms. Judges signing off on suspicious deals, attorneys receiving preferential treatment, and officers with long records of abuse walking free after every hearing, especially if the case ended up in front of Belridge. But when Delgado met Tiana, he knew they finally had a shot. She had something the rest of his team didn't: access to the day-to-day inner workings of the system and a reputation that made people open up. She wasn't flashy. She didn't walk around like a fed. But she knew how to listen, and people talked. A part-time clerk at the county clerk's office told her about late-night edits to court records. A retired bailiff remembered cash envelopes being passed in bathroom hallways. A defense attorney once hinted that getting his client off had nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with who he paid under the table. The files Tiana collected weren't just about Belridge's decisions, they were about his patterns. He always ruled against defendants with public defenders. He dismissed civil suits from black plaintiffs at a rate nearly double the state average. He routinely denied motions that involved officer misconduct. But the numbers were just the surface. The real story was in the paper trail. There were cases where files went missing and reappeared, with key pages removed, notes scribbled in margins in someone else's handwriting, court transcripts that were never certified. Tiana compared them side by side, printing them at home so no one in the department could trace her searches. Late one night, sitting in her kitchen with a pot of black coffee and her laptop, she found what cracked the case open. An old civil suit filed by a woman named Cassandra Bell. Her son had been beaten during a traffic stop. The case never made it past a pre-trial hearing. The judge claimed the video was unverifiable, but Tiana found the original file buried in a backup server. The video had been submitted correctly. The officer's name? Brian Lattimore, the same one who'd pulled over Raylan Cross. The judge? Belridge. Cassandra had tried to refile the case but ran out of money and gave up. Tiana called her, tracked her down through an old address, and asked if she'd be willing to talk. Cassandra's voice cracked over the phone. "No one's asked me about that in years," she said. "I thought everyone forgot." They hadn't. Not Tiana. The pieces began snapping together. There were more names. Attorneys who pushed for fast settlements before evidence could be submitted. Prosecutors who rarely challenged Belridge's decisions. And officers. Always the same officers, showing up in the same courtrooms. Delgado and his team built what they called the grid. It was a wall-sized map connecting cases, rulings, names, dates, and patterns of interference. Tiana's contributions filled most of the board. But what scared them most wasn't the judge himself. It was how many people had looked the other way. Judicial corruption doesn't survive in the shadows, Delgado told her one night. It survives in silence. Tiana knew the courtroom was just the stage. The real story was buried in paper, in whispers, in sealed records and quiet dismissals. And every time Belridge leaned on that gavel, he did it knowing no one would stop him, until now. In the final week before Raylan's hearing, the DOJ approved something rare. Conditional arrest authority. Tiana could make the call. If Belridge showed misconduct again, she didn't need to wait. She had the files, the witness statements, and the digital forensics. She was ready. Still, she wrestled with it. Not because she doubted he was guilty, but because she knew what it would mean. Taking down a judge wasn't like arresting a dealer on the corner. This would ripple across the entire court system. People would ask questions, doors would close. Some would blame her. Some would pretend she never existed. But then she thought of Cassandra Bell, of Raylan, of her sister, of every voice that got drowned out in a courtroom because someone like Belridge decided they weren't worth hearing. She knew what she had to do. But bringing him in was just the first strike. Exposing the rest of the machine would be a different kind of fight entirely. The sound of her heels on the courtroom floor was sharp, measured. Tiana didn't rush when she approached the bench. That's what made it more powerful. No sirens, no shouting, just her, standing there with her federal ID in one hand and control in the other. "Judge Warren Belridge," she repeated, voice clear, calm, undeniable. "You are under arrest." A murmur rippled across the room, jurors looking to each other, attorneys frozen in place. One of the court officers took a step forward, but hesitated when Tiana pulled a second document from her inside pocket. A signed federal warrant, dated and approved. Belridge's mouth opened, but words didn't come out. His face, usually smug and composed, shifted fast. First confusion, then anger, then fear. Real fear. "You don't have the authority to—" Tiana cut him off. "You're being charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify court records, and accepting bribes while acting in a judicial capacity. You have the right to remain silent." She recited the rest like it was second nature. Because it was. But no one in that courtroom had ever seen anything like it before. He tried to stand. "This is absurd. I'll have your badge." Tiana stepped slightly forward. "You're not in charge anymore, Judge." Her words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The court officer at the side wall, a man named Reuben Keller, who'd been working that courtroom for 12 years, finally moved. He looked at Tiana, at her badge, and then at the warrant. Then he walked around the bench and handcuffed Judge Belridge with practiced precision. The same man who'd sent hundreds to jail without blinking now flinched at the sound of his own shackles. "Is this some kind of stunt?" Belridge said, voice cracking. Tiana didn't answer. Across the gallery, Jenna Kessler, the prosecutor, was frozen in disbelief. She whispered something to her assistant, who pulled out a phone, recording the moment without hesitation. Others in the courtroom had already begun doing the same. "Let the record show," Tiana said, looking toward the stenographer, "that this arrest is part of an ongoing federal investigation into judicial corruption. All evidence has been submitted to the Department of Justice and authorized for open action." Reuben led Belridge past the jury box, his head now lowered, eyes darting at the ground like it might swallow him whole. It was quiet, eerily so. But this time, it wasn't the heavy silence of humiliation. It was something else. Respect. Not the kind people give because of a badge or a title. The kind that's earned through action. Tiana didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need backup. She had truth and preparation. That's what made it land. As Belridge was escorted out, someone in the gallery whispered, "About damn time." And then, something even more surprising happened. A woman stood up in the third row, grey cardigan, hands clenched tight in front of her. It was Cassandra Bell. She had driven up that morning from Muncie after Tiana's phone call. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen, just that something might. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. When she stood, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Tiana looked at her, and they exchanged the kind of glance only two people who've survived the same storm can understand. After Belridge was out of the room, Judge Eva Morland, a senior circuit judge, was called in immediately to oversee the remainder of the session. She entered fast, expression unreadable, but it was clear she'd been briefed. Her first act, dismissing the jury until further notice. Court was adjourned, but no one moved. Everyone stayed seated, watching Tiana. She walked out without saying another word. Outside the courthouse, cameras had already gathered. Word spread faster than fire in July. A federal arrest of a sitting judge made by a uniformed officer inside his own courtroom. Unheard of. But it wasn't about media to her. It never had been. As she walked to her unmarked car, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket. 2 missed calls from Agent Delgado. A text that read, "It's done. The rest starts now." But what no one outside knew yet was that Belridge's arrest was only the first domino, and Tiana had already started lining up the others. The arrest made headlines before the court clerk could finish closing the day's docket. Federal judge arrested mid-trial by officer testifying in case. Courtroom stunned as racist outburst leads to immediate arrest. Nobody in uniform? Officer who took down a judge speaks through action. News vans crowded the streets outside Allen County Superior Court before sunset. Social media lit up with shaky courtroom footage from phones. Belridge's arrest from 3 different angles, looped and replayed with subtitles, captions, commentary. In less than 12 hours, the clip hit over 3 million views. But the real impact didn't come from the clicks. It came from the voices that followed. Inside Fort Wayne's police department, people walked a little quieter the next morning. Officers who had once ignored Tiana in the break room suddenly gave nods that meant something. Younger recruits asked questions they'd been too afraid to ask before. Deputy Chief Neil Banning, who hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences to Tiana in a year, sent a single text. "Proud of you. Took guts." Outside the department, phones rang off the hook at the courthouse. Reporters wanted statements, defense attorneys wanted retrials, activists were calling for audits, and the families who had spent years being ignored finally felt like someone had heard them. Cassandra Bell gave a quiet interview to a local journalist in her kitchen. She didn't cry, just held her son's photo and said, "Maybe now somebody else's kid won't get crushed because they couldn't afford a lawyer." The public wasn't the only one reacting. Behind closed doors, the Indiana Judicial Conduct Commission launched an immediate investigation. Court administrators started reviewing Belridge's prior cases, nearly 2,000 rulings going back 10 years. A team was assembled to analyze sentencing discrepancies, evaluate motions he'd denied, and review cases that were mysteriously sealed. Some judges who once called Belridge a strict traditionalist now distanced themselves. But the most telling reaction came from inside his own chambers. His court clerk, a soft-spoken man named Glenn Masters, resigned that afternoon. He left a short statement taped to the office door. "What I saw happen today should have happened years ago. I can't serve a system that protects people like him." Tiana didn't read the papers. She didn't watch the videos. She sat at her kitchen table, eating reheated lasagna and scanning through names on a spreadsheet she'd kept hidden in her Dropbox for almost 5 years. Every name was a thread, every thread a connection. Lattimore, Viers, Judge Durrell Knox in Kokomo, Prosecutor Bryce Henley in Allen County. A pattern of selective prosecutions and sealed plea deals was beginning to come into focus. The DOJ had called earlier that day. Delgado's voice was steady. "We're moving forward with the next round of subpoenas. You've opened the door, Mosley. We walk through it now." She didn't respond right away, just stared at her screen. Her dog Ruby sat beside her chair, tail flicking gently, sensing something had shifted. Across town, Raylan Cross sat in his living room with his mom, watching the news replay the arrest. He turned to her and asked, "So, does this mean my case is gonna be different now?" His mom put a hand on his shoulder and said, "It already is." The court set a new date for Raylan's hearing, this time under a different judge. The doorbell video would be admitted. Tiana would testify again, but now as a federal officer. It wasn't just about one kid anymore. It was about a system that had failed too many people, too many times. And one woman who finally said, "Not on my watch." But Tiana knew the hardest part wasn't over. Arresting Belridge was the strike. The reckoning that followed would test everything, how deep the system would go to protect itself, and how loud the truth had to be to cut through it. But for the first time in years, the silence wasn't winning, and neither was fear. 3 weeks after the arrest, Tiana Mosley sat alone in a small cafe on the corner of Fairfield Avenue and West Berry Street. No cameras, no press. Just her, a black coffee, and the notebook she'd carried for the last 7 years. The one with the first notes on Judge Belridge scribbled on its second page. She didn't write in it that day. She just flipped through the old pages, silently reading what she'd been forced to keep hidden for so long. Her hands ran across dates, names, and margin notes, each one representing a moment she'd nearly given up. There had been nights where she thought maybe none of it would matter, that the system would always protect itself, that her silence would be the only thing that kept her from losing everything she'd worked for. But that day in court proved something else. Silence might protect your job, but truth protects people. And people are worth the risk. When she left the cafe, a woman stopped her outside. Early 60s, soft eyes, windbreaker zipped up high. "You're the one who arrested that judge, right?" The woman asked, voice low but steady. Tiana hesitated, then nodded. The woman didn't say thank you. She didn't go into a speech. She just said, "My brother did 5 years for something he didn't do." Judge Belridge sat on his case. Then she walked away. That was all. But it was everything. Because that's what justice is sometimes. It's not applause. It's not a press conference. It's the quiet weight of a wrong finally made right, even if only in part. Tiana knew Belridge would fight the charges. He'd lawyer up, try to twist the narrative, try to frame her as some rogue officer with a personal vendetta. But he couldn't erase the footage, couldn't change the files, couldn't talk his way out of a federal warrant issued under a mountain of evidence. And most of all, he couldn't undo what had already been seen by millions of people around the country. People like Raylan, like Cassandra Bell, like that woman outside the cafe. People who'd been dismissed, ignored, punished. People who'd finally seen that power could be held accountable. At a DOJ meeting held in Indianapolis 2 weeks later, Tiana was asked to speak to a small group of young investigators. She didn't prepare a speech, just shared a story. She told them about how justice takes time, how it requires a stomach for waiting, for being doubted, for being talked over and cast aside. How sometimes, to catch the loudest wrongdoer, you have to move in silence until it's time to act. She ended with a line that wasn't flashy, but it stuck. Do your job with your eyes open, and when your hands shake, let them shake. But don't back down. That was it. No applause, just nods. Weeks passed. Raylan's new hearing date approached. Officer Lattimore was suspended pending investigation. Veers resigned. The Indiana Commission on Judicial Qualifications announced a full audit of Belridge's rulings over the last decade. Cases were being reopened. Defendants previously denied fair hearings were being contacted. And Tiana? She kept working. Not from a desk, not from a podium, but from where she'd always felt most useful. In the field. She kept her head down. She took calls, she chased leads, she handed over everything she knew, even when it brought her face to face with people who used to laugh behind her back. Because to her, none of it was about revenge. It was about the people who never got to tell their story. The ones who were told they didn't matter. Who were looked in the eye by someone in power and made to feel small. Tiana never wanted to be famous. She never cared about going viral. All she ever wanted was for people like Raylan to walk into a courtroom and know they'd be heard. And maybe now, they would. If this story hit something in you, if it reminded you why truth matters, even when it's hard, then share it. Talk about it. Teach someone. Speak when you're scared. Ask questions when they want silence. Because justice doesn't move unless we push. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what integrity looks like and what courage costs.